All right, so we are going to start with spinal nerves. So we finished up last time talking about cranial nerves. So the 12 pairs of nerves coming off of or going into the brain, depending on which one it is. And now we're going to talk about spinal nerves, which are the nerves coming off of the spinal cord that supply the entire rest of the body. So there's 31 pairs, and they all carry both motor information to the body, and they bring sensory information back in from the body. And we name them basically in how they come off of the spinal cord, but it happens to correspond to our vertebrae. So remember that we have cervical vertebrae, and we have 7 of them. And then we have 12 thoracic vertebrae and 5 lumbar vertebrae. And there are 8 cervical nerve pairs, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and then there's 5 sacral and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves in that they come out along with the coccyx, or where the coccyx is. So what that looks like is that the first 7 spinal nerves come out above or superior to the vertebral segment that they correspond to, like that, okay? And then the 8th cervical comes out between the 7th cervical vertebrae, and it's right here, and the 1st thoracic. And so then after that, all of them come out below the vertebrae that they're numbered with, or that they're paired to, like you can see. And then there are little holes in the sacrum that the sacral ones come out of. And then there's a little ending thing here that the coccygeal ones can come out of too. Oh. So that's how we identify and order them, because they do correspond to these different places with the vertebrae. So the vertebrae and the spinal nerves, spinal cord all go together. Now every spinal nerve has the same basic structure to it. So as the axons move between the spinal cord itself and the nerves, there's a dorsal root that's carrying all the sensory information back to the spinal cord, and then most of it goes up to the brain. And then there's a ventral root, and that carries all the motor information from the brain and spinal cord out to the body. And so these guys join up as this nerve exits the vertebrae, and this is what we call the actual spinal nerve. So here's our model pictures here. So you can see spinal cord, sensory information being carried by this dorsal root, motor information on this ventral root, and this is anterior here and posterior back here. Because remember, dorsal is pretty much the same thing as posterior, but this is one of those places where we use it instead. I don't know why they did that, but they do. And ventral is the same as anterior. So they come out together very briefly, and then they almost immediately branch again. So each spinal nerve has several branches, and they're called rami. A ramus is a branch. And so there's a dorsal ramus, a ventral ramus, a meningeal branch, and then there's also these little guys called rami communicantes that I'll show you too. So here's a different diagram. So again, this is the dorsal root carrying sensory information. This is the dorsal root ganglion, and it has the sensory neuron cell bodies in it. So sensory information is heading this direction, up this root, and motor information is going this way down the ventral root. So they combine together as a spinal nerve, and then they almost immediately branch. So we have a dorsal ramus because this branch goes to the dorsal aspect of the body, and you can see that there are both motor and sensory aspects here. There's a ventral ramus that goes to the ventral aspects of the body. We'll talk more about that in a second. The little meningeal branch never actually gets diagrammed, poor little thing, but it basically branches, turns around, goes back into the vertebral canal, and it supplies the meninges, those tissue structures surrounding the spinal cord. And then these little gray and white ramus guys are part of the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk briefly about them again later. The ones we really care about right now are the dorsal and ventral ramus. So the dorsal rami supply all the somatic aspects of the posterior body trunk. So when we say somatic, we mean skeletal system and muscular system and skin. And then the ventral rami supply the anterior aspect of the trunk as well as everything on the limbs, both upper limbs and lower limbs. So again, this is somatic, so skeletal, muscular, and skin. Now, some of the ventral rami have to mingle as they make their way to their various sensory receptors and effectors. And that's because not all the axons coming and going out of a single spinal segment are actually going the same direction or the same place. So they're going to come together in things called nerve plexuses, which we're going to look at next. And then this is what I told you before, the meningeal branches literally turn right back around, go into the vertebral canal, and provide innervation to the meninges and blood vessels inside. And that's the last you'll hear of the poor little guys because they don't get a lot of attention. So a plexus is anytime we have a bunch of things coming together and like commingling and then kind of going different ways in different combinations. And most of the ventral rami of our spinal nerves form plexuses. So we actually have 4 plexuses formed of multiple ventral rami. And we'll very briefly touch on each one. The only ventral rami that don't do this are the thoracic nerves. And we'll see why in a second. So we basically name them for the parts of the body that they then innervate. So for example, the cervical plexus is formed by most of the cervical ventral rami. And you don't need to know this, but it's like C1 through 4 to 5. And so the sensation for the skin of like your neck and the back of your head and your shoulders and control over muscles over the front of your neck, the nerves are coming from all of those rami. And then their only like super important nerve that's in here that doesn't just do local stuff is the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve actually runs all the way through your thorax, and then it controls your diaphragm. And your diaphragm is the muscular sheet that separates your thorax from your abdomen, and it's the primary breathing muscle. So our ability to breathe is actually controlled by a nerve that comes out of the top of your neck, runs all the way down the inside of your thorax, and then attaches to your diaphragm, which is really weird. And it's one of the reasons why we can get hiccups, because it runs next to your esophagus a lot and other things, and it can get irritated. All right, so that's how plexuses work. Your next one is the brachial plexus, and it's named that because it's all the nerves that run between the spinal cord and your upper limb. And since we call the upper part of the upper limb a brachium, that just means arm. This is the arm plexus, okay? So interestingly, the control over the arm is actually from the spinal segments of the rest of the cervical and then the very first thoracic. So we control it all up here, basically at our neck. And then they have this plexus where all the axons separate. And then we have a couple of big nerves that control the arm. And in classes where they get into a lot of detail, they have to learn all of them and what they do and stuff. And luckily, we don't have to do that at all. So we just need to know the brachial plexus does the upper limb, it's the rest of the cervical ventral rami. Everything else does the rest of the body. So the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus kind of work together, and they share a couple of nerves. So they're often referred to together as the lumbosacral plexus. And they provide the nerves for not only the lower limbs, but also your butt and your pelvis and your abdomen. And when we talk about pelvis and abdomen, we're mostly referring to the anterior, and again, this is somatic, so it's the skin and muscles and stuff. So like your abdominal muscles, like when you're doing sit-ups, that's going to be controlled by nerves coming off of like your lumbar plexus. So they kind of come off like this, and of course you can see again, they're all kind of mixing and mingling, and they kind of come down here. And some of the really big nerves in your body are right here, including your sciatic nerve, which did I put? I did not, which is like the largest nerve in your body. And it, of course, like runs down like the back of your leg, and it can get irritated and you can have shooting pains and it's not fun. Okay, so that's how everything kind of separates out. So your ventral rami are really complicated. When we look at our thoracic nerves and we look at our dorsal rami, we see that it's not that complicated. So the ventral rami of the thoracic spinal nerves just each forms what we call an intercostal nerve. And that's because they come out and they just run in between two ribs. So literally means between ribs. And they just innervate the muscle, skin, and bone of the front and sides of the body, which is the same thing that the dorsal rami do as well. And so because we have them coming out from each segment, it forms this segmental or striped pattern. And then this is just kind of one of those random detail-y things. Technically, the last one isn't an intercostal nerve because we only have 12 ribs and the 12th spinal nerve is below the last rib, so it's actually the subcostal nerve. Gets a special name. Doesn't matter, does the same thing. They all just kind of do this. So here's the ventral ramus. Instead of there being a plexus, it's just like, yay, here's the ribs and the muscles, and we just go and, you know, we carry all the sensory information back and we send all this motor information out to control these muscles. Cool. And that's actually what all the dorsal rami of all of the spinal nerves do as well. So the dorsal rami also innervate the body in a segmental pattern. And they pretty much just do the posterior aspect of the trunk because the ventral rami do the legs. So there's no plexuses again. So it's just this little narrow strip of muscle and skin that each nerve is actually controlling. So this is kind of what it looks like. So again, instead of plexuses, and these aren't the whole thing, these are more like just a couple of branches, but you can see it's this regular pattern. So we're kind of controlled by stripes of things. And that's sort of the default way that nerves work. But because arms and legs are complicated, we had to do plexuses to make all the axons run the right way. So one of the consequences, especially of the segmental innervation of the dorsal rami and the thoracic ventral rami, is that different parts of the skin are, their sensory input is carried by this single nerve. And so if something disrupts that pathway, you'll have like a strip of skin that's numb and maybe a strip of muscle that you can't control anymore. And so that segmental pattern is called a dermatome, where any area of skin that is only supplied by a single spinal nerve is considered a dermatome as a region. And so you'll find these diagrams where the surface of the body is kind of mapped out, and the different spinal nerves are represented on different parts of the body. So, for example, you know, like you can see up here, the back of your head is just C2. So if something went wrong with just your second cervical nerve, the back of your head might go numb. Probably be a bad thing. And then if you look all the way down here, like the back of your heel and the bottom of your foot and stuff is by the first sacral nerve. And so like if something went numb there, then it might indicate a problem at that level of the nerve output. So these kinds of things get used to test nervous system function in instances of like injuries and other problems. And it's also just kind of cool because you get this weird funky map situation going on. All right, any questions about spinal nerves before we move on to other stuff? All right, so then we're gonna go to the rest of the peripheral nervous system. I did decide to take a few slides out. So I uploaded the new version, but if you printed out or downloaded a version of this before lecture, you have extra slides. So just, you know, cross them out as you get to them. Everything's taking longer than I thought, and I'm trying really hard to actually maximize streamlining. So I took another editing round and said, okay, we really need to keep cutting this back. So if you find that you've got slides that I don't have, it's because I just cut them out. So just cross them off. You don't need to know information on slides that, that aren't in this PowerPoint. Okay, so the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves are the anatomy part of the peripheral nervous system, but when we look at the functional aspects of it, we divide it into a somatic and an autonomic. So we're just going to touch on which one does what, and we're going to be able to look at the similarities and differences and sort of the major features of each of those systems. So first, what we need to look at is the sensory receptors. Sensory receptors are all of the specialized nerve endings that are able to respond to different changes in the environment. So any change in the environment that a receptor is able to respond to is called a stimulus. And we have a lot of different receptors to respond to a lot of different stimuli. The consequence of stimulus on a receptor is the production of graded potentials. And if we have enough graded potential production, then we can potentially get action potentials and signals getting sent to the spinal cord in the brain. If we send information to the brain, then we will become aware of the stimulus, and we call that awareness sensation. So when you know that, you know, you're being touched or something's warm or you're seeing something, that awareness is called sensation. And then when you actually apply information to that sensation, we call that perception. So interpretation of the meaning of a stimulus is perception. So for example, if you know, if you feel a touch and you look down and it's because somebody's hand is on your arm trying to get your attention, or, you know, your animal is right there hoping to get petted, once you become aware of like, oh, you know, my dog is nosing me and that's why I'm feeling this, that's the perception part. Okay, so there's different levels of awareness, basically, and processing that occur in response to these sensory receptors. Sensory receptors, just like neurons and other things, have different classification schemes. And we're going to go over them because those classification schemes also explain to us what types of things we're able to respond to. Okay, so we can divide up sensory receptors by the type of stimulus they respond to, by their location in the body, and by how complex they are. We also do worry about how they are able to transduce the stimulus, so convert it into electrical activity, and we're not going to worry about that too much because it doesn't really add to anything at our level. So if we look at stimulus type and how that is going to give us categories, we basically split things up by stuff that's basically touch and feel. So mechanoreceptors respond to mechanical forces. That includes touch pressure. It includes stretch. So anything that that can get stretched in your body, that's able to detect that. Vibration, things like that. Thermoreceptors are going to be able to detect hot or cold. That's close enough. Photoreceptors detect light, so there's only one place for these guys. They're in our eyes. Chemoreceptors detect a variety of chemicals. So most of these are monitoring our blood for different changes, but we certainly do have some chemoreceptors, for example, in our skin, and that's generally how we end up with feelings like itchiness. And then the last one is called nociceptors. So nociceptors are what detect stimuli that we interpret as pain. It comes from the root for the word noxious. And so anything that our body might be damaged by is typically going to cause nociceptors to respond. It has to kind of be at the level that would cause damage though. So we have thermoreceptors for detecting hot or cold, but if the temperature is extreme enough that it could burn us or, you know, hurt us by being cold, then it would trigger the nociceptors too. Chemicals that are harmful, pressure to the point where it would hurt, you know, the sharp, cutty type things that can damage our skin, all of that is going to trigger our nociceptors and therefore sensations of pain. So those are our stimulus types. This is just a cool picture of some mechanoreceptors that are good at detecting like pressure and touch. They're very special. When we look at location, we end up with three options. So receptors that can detect stuff that's outside of our body, we call those exteroceptors. So these typically are located near at our body surface. So most of these are in our skin, in or under our skin. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them. The opposite of outside of our body is inside of our body. So interoceptors are typically located deep in our body. A lot of them are in internal organs. A lot of them are in blood vessels, other internalized structures. And so stimuli, things that are changing inside of our body, are going to be detected by this. Now, we're less likely to be aware of the input that comes from those guys than we are of the input that comes from these guys. The third one is sort of a subcategory of interoceptors. They're called proprioceptors, and they are all the ones that are related to body movement and body position. So we have a lot of receptors in our muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, as well as any connective tissues associated with those structures. that are all keeping track of exactly where our body is in space. And so that information is different and separate from things like what's going on in your blood vessels and your stomach. And so there's two different categories there. Finally, when we look at receptor structure, so we're looking at the actual physical makeup of the sensory receptor, we have two types. Basically, some of them have their dendritic endings modified more than others. So when there's a lot of modifications to the ending of the sensory neuron, so that's the dendrites, that those receive information, we call them encapsulated. And that's because essentially they'll have extra cells and other structures surrounding the ending of the nerve, and that's going to basically be a capsule. Sometimes they just look like naked dendrite endings, and so those are non-encapsulated. Now the special senses have an additional classification where they have sense organs, so they have these entire complex structures composed of multiple cells, both neurons and non-neural cells, and that's a whole other category based on structure, and we'll cover those briefly in special senses, which I guess I'm gonna have to do like a bonus lecture because we're running out of time and there's no way we're getting to that today. So here's our three options. Non-encapsulated is just free nerve endings is what we call it. Encapsulated is when we have extra stuff. And then our special senses can have specialized additional cells and whole specialized structures. These are just some examples of encapsulated and non-encapsulated nerve endings or receptor endings. You don't need to know any of these, I just like pictures. So that takes us to our next step, which is how does the sensory information coming in get processed so that we are able to have these sensations and perceptions? And so we call that the somatosensory system, and it requires integration. So remember, integration is the second of the three functions of the nervous system, right? We have sensory input, and we just talked about how that'll happen, and integration, and then we have motor output, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So integration occurs whenever we have synapses. So synapses are required for processing information, and there's three levels of synapsing that occurs in sensory tracts. So those are the three places where information can be modified as it makes its way all the way up to your cortex, and then you hopefully become aware of it. So at the receptor level, we can look at different aspects to how these receptors work. And so the major points are that in order to actually stimulate a sensory receptor, it has to be the right kind of stimulus. So our receptors are very, very specific. So that means that if you have a thermoreceptor, it's only going to respond to a change in temperature. You're not going to trigger it with, some vibrations or pressure or light, unless that light is really warm also. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is something called the receptive field, which I'll show you in a second. And then transduction is just the word we use for taking that stimulus and converting it into electrical signals. I thought I had, hold on. Oh, okay, I just put them in the wrong order. Okay, so converting the energy of the stimulus, whether that's touch, pressure, sunlight, heat, cold, whatever, and converting it into electrical signals. So graded potentials And we know that if we have enough of them to bring a neuron to threshold, then we'll get action potentials. And then we can actually send information to the central nervous system. The receptive fields are just the idea that there's a certain area that these dendrites of these sensory neurons can actually cover. And so if a stimulus occurs outside of that area, it cannot stimulate the receptor. Receptive fields have different sizes, even of the same type of receptor. And so this is showing you that like receptors for touch have different size receptive fields based on the part of the body. So like your hand is a very, very sensitive place. We're able to feel a lot of detail with our fingertips. And that's because the receptive field for each individual touch receptor is very, very small. So in order to feel a touch at a particular area, it has to really hit that point exactly. And if it hits over here, it's going to stimulate a different sensory neuron. And your brain knows which one is being stimulated, and that gives you a lot of detail there. Now, if you look at somewhere like your back, we might have one sensory neuron covering a very large area. And so any touch in that area registers as simply a stimulation of that receptor. And we can't tell with any more detail where we're being touched. And we can't tell if we get touched more than once in that place, it still registers as one because we're just stimulating the same neuron. Okay, so that's receptive field. One thing that can happen at the level of sensory receptors is the ability to change their sensitivity to a stimulus. So adaptation is decreasing the sensitivity of a stimulus in the presence of a constant stimulus. So basically, there's a lot of sensations that our neurons will just start ignoring if they're constant. And there's a lot of good things about that. So a lot of our mechanoreceptors, for example, use adaptation. And that's why we can wear clothes and not have them constantly drive us crazy with our awareness of what the clothes feel like on our bodies. Because we just stop paying attention. Our receptors literally start ignoring the stimulus of the touch of our clothes because of this adaptation process. Now, there are other things that don't adapt. Nociceptors, so our ability to detect pain, never changes because our receptors ignore it. So even if we're experiencing a very constant level of pain, those receptors are still going to keep reporting that very faithfully to the central nervous system. So that's what's occurring at the level of the receptors. And then we're going to have signals being sent up to the spinal cord where they can be processed at a circuit level or up here in the cortex. So there's a lot of things that can happen, and some of them are reflexes. And some of those reflexes can happen in the brainstem as well as in the spinal cord. And we'll talk about spinal cord reflexes in a little bit. But I want to give you some examples of the type of stuff that can happen at the circuit level. So 2 examples. The first one is sound localization. So sound localization is our ability to turn our head in the direction of a sound that we hear. And that's because we have synapses, we have a whole nucleus in the brainstem that gets the hearing information from both of your ears. And by calculating the difference between when the sound hit each ear and the difference in how loud it sounds to each ear, it's able to tell exactly where that sound was coming from. And then it controls the muscles of your head and neck and your eyes to let you turn and look exactly at where you heard the sound. And so these are some pictures of that and knowing where that sound is coming from. So that's an example of circuit level processing where we have synapses The other one is the ability to stay focused on whatever you're looking at, even if your head and body are moving. So this is called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And basically, it's your vestibular sense. We'll talk about that later, but it's it's where your head is in space, so you know if it's holding still or if you're moving, and you know like if your head's tilted and stuff. And so that information gets transmitted to another brainstem nucleus, and then it controls the muscles of your eyes to hold your eyes in place. And it was funnier to show you a video of chickens. Chickens can't really move their eyes the way we can, but they can move their heads. And so they're doing the same thing with their heads that we do with our eyes. So it looks like their head isn't moving because their body is, but actually their muscles are moving a lot to keep their heads perfectly still. Okay, so that's stuff that's happening at the circuit level. And then the last level of processing is going to be up here. So when we look at perceptual level processing, now we're seeing what happens when your brain is actually interpreting the input to your cerebral cortex and then controlling exactly what you're actually aware of. So one of the ways that it's able to do this is that your brain knows exactly which sensations it's receiving and from exactly which part of the body it receives them. And this is because the information bundles itself into specific pathways as it travels up your spinal cord. Now, because perception is our awareness of what a sensation is and what the meaning of it is, it means that there's a lot of processing that goes on before we're able to get to the point of perception. And so there's a lot of shortcuts that our brain takes when it's doing this perceiving. And because of that, there's actually a lot of things where we can be especially visually fooled by simple tricks like these optical illusions. So this one over here, for example, this is technically just a series of lines. But when we look at it, we'll see a cube, and sometimes we see a cube that's kind of facing down and to the right, and sometimes we see a cube that's facing up and to the left. So if you focus on the darker set of lines, you should see a cube that's facing down, and I guess it's to the it's to the left. Sorry. And then if you focus on the set of lighter colored lines, this square here, now you should see a box that's facing, that's more up, slanted up, and facing this direction. Okay, you guys see that, hopefully? And so that's because your brain has this shortcut for three-dimensional space, where when lines meet in certain ways, it assigns them a three-dimensional value. So this is a two-dimensional thing, but we're seeing a three-dimensional structure. We also do the same thing with color and shading as we do with this perspective stuff. So if you look at these two boxes, so we've got box A over here, and we've got box B down here. So which one do you think is darker? Let me redo that. That was just a mess. So I'm guessing you're all thinking, well, obviously box A is darker. How could she even ask us that? It's super obvious, right? Well, I hear what you're saying, but the thing is that the shade of gray in box A and box B, it's actually the exact same color. Oh, wait. Next time I'm remembering to actually put in the one that takes everything out. So if you remove all of the other hues, you should be able to see that they're the same shade of gray. I hope you can all appreciate that. And the reason why they look different is because your brain knows things like, well, when something's in shadow, the shadow makes it look darker than when it's not. And when something's in bright light, then that color is pretty accurate. So when you take these two squares that are the same color and you put one of them in shadow amidst much darker squares and one of them amidst these lighter squares, now they look like different colors. And you cannot make your brain see it differently. Even though I know better and I just demonstrated to you that it's true, I still see B is lighter than A. So that's how perception works. Our brain takes these shortcuts and we cannot change that a lot of the time. This is another example that's very similar to the last one. So this is a modified picture of a bunch of strawberries, right? And if you're like me, those strawberries look pretty red. I mean, they look a little weird because the whole picture kind of has this weird bluish tint to it, right? But this image actually doesn't contain any red. There's no red in here. Those strawberries are actually gray. But the contrast of the way that this part is blue, and because we know those are strawberries and we know they're supposed to be red, we're able to see them as red. But if you separate it out from the context, then you start to be able to see it more and more as gray. And I know that doesn't quite do it, but I don't feel like scribbling that much. So if you go to the websites where these guys came from, then you can see the step-by-steps and the explanations. But this one's a perfect example of why a couple of years ago on the internet, this dress went viral and everybody was arguing about what color it was, or colors. So some people said it was blue and black, some people said it was gray, gold and white, and there was a right answer. It doesn't really matter what it was because, you know, you can measure the actual colors used to make each pixel. But what matters is that the way that we perceived those colors in the context in which we were given determined what we thought the colors were. So just like those strawberries looked red when there was no red in that picture, just like those squares look like they were different shades of gray when they're the same ones. That's why everyone was debating about this dress. Nobody was wrong. You were totally valid in what you were seeing, but your specific context, the way your brain looked or learned to take shortcuts to perceive color, was what determined which one you saw. So that's perception level processing. It's a whole lot of shortcuts that your brain takes in order to present you with what it thinks is a realistic representation of the world around you. But a lot of it isn't real because we wouldn't have time to process all the information that we're getting inundated with in real time, if that makes sense. So that's why we have all these shortcuts, and those result in our ability to see things like these optical illusions. Okay, so that's how we get sensory information into the brain and what happens to it so that we have perception. And then when we look at how we're able to have motor output, we have to look at the opposite pathway. So we're going to look real quick at the basic steps of motor output for skeletal muscle, and that's going to take us into how reflexes work, and that should lead us right into autonomic function. If I don't finish autonomic function, then I will finish it up when I cover special senses. So one of the first things to understand here, and this will make more sense as we go through reflexes, is that even though skeletal muscle is categorized as voluntary, we don't always have voluntary control over all of our muscles. We can, and that's the big difference between skeletal muscle and the other effectors that we have in the system, but we don't always. So some examples of that, for example, oh boy, that was bad, sorry about that. So for example, most of the time when we breathe, we don't think about it. So we have an automatic breathing because in our brainstem, there are neurons that create a pattern of regular breathing. But then whenever we think about breathing for any reason, either because somebody's mentioning it, or because you realize you're stressed out and you have to take a deep breath, or because you're talking and so you have to control your airflow, then higher level function takes over, and now our diaphragm is under voluntary control until we don't have to do it anymore, and then we forget, and then these brainstem controls take over again. And then the reflexes that we're going to talk about in a few slides are the same way. It's skeletal muscle control, but it's not under conscious decision. It's not voluntary at that moment, okay? So that's kind of a big thing about skeletal muscle is we aren't always controlling these voluntary muscles, even though sometimes they're doing stuff. In order to have that dual control, and in order to have all of the various brain systems be involved in this that need to be, because motor output's a really complex situation, we again have different levels of control for different types of motor activity. So we're gonna quickly go through these guys and just kind of see why we have different levels of control, and then we'll get into reflexes. So this is just a basic flow showing you how that works. So this is what we call the pre-command. And then we've got some segmental stuff here. And then this and this is the projection level. So pre-command, basically, there are parts of the cerebral cortex where we get to make conscious decisions about what we're going to do. So anytime I decide that I'm gonna go get up and take a walk, or I'm gonna sit on the couch, I'm gonna have a drink of water, scroll through my phone, whatever I'm doing, that starts in my cerebral cortex. But my cerebral cortex doesn't just say, all right, muscles, do your thing. Instead, it informs the basal nuclei at the base of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So remember that guy at the back of your skull. And they actually plan and coordinate whatever movements the cerebral cortex has decided upon, because they're a lot better at it. So we call it pre-command because the command level is what the cerebral cortex decides to do, but the pre-command level is how the cerebellum and the basal nuclei actually take care of the decision. So this is kind of a flow chart of that and everything else, all the hierarchies. Not going to go into anything. So that's kind of all you need to know about that is, I guess I will go back. So this is one of those ones where it uses the old term of ganglius, but basal nuclei and the cerebellum, they're the ones that are actually controlling this stuff. We're not worried about that. So then the segmental level is things that happen at the level of the spinal cord without having to go up to the brain. And so all of our automatic movements are being controlled at the segmental level. So this is reflexes and other automatic things that your spinal cord can take care of on its own. And like I said, we'll talk about reflexes in a second. So then the projection level is basically the interface between those two things. So at the projection level, we are literally projecting control over the spinal cord and the actual muscles from the brain. And that lets us do things like override automatic movements. We can sometimes override or alter reflexes and other stuff like that. Okay, so this allows interaction between the automatic stuff and the voluntary stuff. So that's kind of happening here and here. Anybody have any questions before we actually get into reflexes? All right, so we are ultimately going to cover two types of reflexes. We're going to cover somatic reflexes right now, and then we're going to cover visceral reflexes after we talk about the autonomic nervous system. So this is comparing and contrasting them, so you can refer back to it later when we've actually talked about both kinds. So a reflex, and this applies to all of them, is an action performed as a response to a stimulus without conscious thought. There is no upper level processing to reflexes. Now, we can be born with reflexes. There's plenty that we're all born with. Some of them are learned, so we have to experience the world in order to develop them. And then, as I just pointed out, some of them are somatic, which means that they involve skeletal muscle, and some of them are visceral, which means that they involve all of the other effectors: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And that's the biggest difference between those two categories. So we're going to talk about some somatic ones right now, and like I said, we'll talk about visceral ones later. Now, all reflexes have a 5-component arc, and this reflex arc is basically the same thing as a negative feedback loop. So the same steps that go through a negative feedback loop are going to apply to this. So you're going to have a receptor, a sensory receptor, and it's going to transduce the signal of a stimulus, so convert the stimulus energy into electrical energy, and the sensory neuron is then going to carry that information to the central nervous system. So sometimes this is the same thing, but it's still two steps, sorry. So the receptor the receptor is stimulated and the neuron carries the information. The integration center is in the central nervous system. Most of them are in the spinal cord, but some of them can be in the brainstem. And this is where any processing occurs to bring about the second half of the reflex. So this is where we're going to have synapses, because that's how integration happens. And a lot of them are as simple as the sensory neuron synapses with the motor neuron. So once the integration center decides to carry out the reflex, it sends motor information down to motor neuron, and that goes to an effector, which is of course going to carry out the action of the reflex. And in somatic ones, again, that's always going to be skeletal muscle. And so a lot of the time, that muscle is going to contract, and sometimes it relaxes. Those are its only options because it's skeletal muscle. So let's look at a couple of examples of how that works and go through these steps. So this is just another thing to look at the steps. So the receptor is in nerve ending in your fingertip. It perceives pain because this person decided to touch a candle. That was smart. The sensory receptor, or the sensory neuron, sorry, then sends that information up to the spinal cord. So that's number 2. We have integration in the spinal cord, which says, okay, that hurts, we better pull our hand away. And so then the motor neuron carries the signal to the muscle that'll actually do that, and your arm flexes and pulls it away from the source of pain. So that's called a withdrawal reflex. We'll look at it one more time in a couple of slides. So although these are often occurring at the level of the spinal cord, and so therefore we call them spinal reflexes, your brain is still receiving information about the reflex. So you still know it's happening. It's just that it needs to happen fast enough that we can't let the brain process it and make the decision. But the brain can facilitate the reflex, so make it happen more easily. It can inhibit the reflex, or it can adapt the reflex and change it as necessary. And in fact, we need constant facilitating signals from the brain to have normal reflex activity. Because without it, our muscles are not going to respond the same way. Now, because of that, this is another aspect of, we need an uninterrupted signal throughout our entire nervous system. And so we can test the function of the nervous system by testing reflexes. So let's look at the most common one we talk about, which is the stretch reflex. So the goal of the stretch reflex is to make sure that a muscle stays at whatever length the brain sets. So this is one of the ways that we maintain muscle tone and adjust it reflexively as needed. So the muscles that this is especially essential in is our postural muscles. So postural muscles are anything involved in keeping us sitting upright, standing upright, whatever. So the sensory receptor for this is called a muscle spindle, and it sits inside of the muscle, and it literally registers how stretched it is. The more stretched it is, the more signals it sends. When it's not stretched, it sends fewer signals. When it's contracting on purpose, it doesn't send signals, because otherwise that would accidentally get read as stretched, and that would be bad. Well, not bad, just redundant. So the way a stretch reflex works is the spindle detects a stretch. So that's number one. And then the sensory neuron sends that information back to the spinal cord. And then integration is literally the sensory neuron synapsing with the motor neuron. That's number three. The motor neuron then sends a signal down to the muscle in which the receptor is. And so that's the effector, and it contracts. So the stretch reflex that you're likely used to, I did not, is, I'll come right back to that, is the patellar reflex. So with the patellar reflex, you're sitting with your leg dangling, and usually it's a doctor, hits right under your patella with a little rubber hammer, and your knee twitches. And that's because you're hitting the tendon connected to the muscle up here. It triggers your muscle spindle in here, sends sensory information, which synapses with the motor neuron, sends it back to that muscle and causes a contraction. And that's because it's saying, oh, you're getting too stretched out, we better correct that, and that twitch is meant to do that. Now, that is about as simple as you can get for a reflex. But even with that simple of a reflex, things are more complicated than that. So reciprocal inhibition is the process by which, if a muscle opposes the action of a muscle involved in a reflex, we want to make sure it doesn't interfere. So reciprocal inhibition will relax an opposing muscle so that if a muscle is contracting for a reflex, it doesn't get blocked. And it's a secondary reflex that gets triggered by the same stimulus that triggers the primary reflex. So if we look at this again, when the muscle spindle is stimulated, and we have the sensory information coming up here, there's a second integration center that sends motor neuron information out to the muscles on the other side of the leg, because those are the ones that are opposing, and make sure that they relax. And that relaxation allows the contraction here to actually successfully move the leg. All right? So what starts as one reflex is actually two. And we see that that actually happens a lot. So the withdrawal reflex, the one that I talked to you about before, the withdrawal reflex is very similar in that you're contracting muscles in response to a stimulus. But now, of course, your stimulus is pain, and you're specifically flexing that part of the body because that's going to bring it back to you and away from the pain. But just like the stretch reflex, there is actually an additional reflex that sometimes goes along with the withdrawal reflex. And it's a little bit like reciprocal inhibition and a little bit different. The reason why we have a secondary reflex is that sometimes, even though you're reflexively contracting or flexing, saying reflexively flexing is so awful. Even though you're withdrawing the limb, you might be standing on it. So you're walking along, you accidentally step on something sharp or you stub your toe or something, and you flex your leg and you bring it up towards your body, but you were standing on it. So the way that you don't fall over is by extending your other leg so that it can keep you upright. So we call it a crossed extensor reflex, because when one limb is flexing, the other one that's across the spinal cord is extending. And you can this actually does work with your arms too, if you happen to be bearing weight with your arms when a withdrawal reflex occurs. But you're normally not, and so it doesn't usually happen. So the crossed extensor reflex doesn't have to accompany a withdrawal, but it will if it needs to, if that makes sense. So it looks like this. There's a lot going on here. So watch what happens. So the withdrawal reflex is here. So your negative stimulus is right here, and it's sending sensory information up to your spinal cord. Please note the dorsal root ganglia holding your sensory neuron. And it's going to integrate with a couple of extra neurons here. So we got synapses, and that's ultimately going to connect it to the flexor muscles, so that, that's 4, sorry, that's 3. I promised I would actually do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that we're withdrawing the limb. Now, every single time we have a withdrawal or flexor reflex, we also need to have reciprocal inhibition so that the extensors of the same limb are relaxed and not opposing the action. So our reciprocal inhibition is right here, and we're relaxing the extensors. So a flexor reflex, a reciprocal inhibition, and then we also are going to have this crossed extensor reflex. So the same stimulus is also going to cross to the other side of the spinal cord. That's where the cross part comes in. And it's going to synapse and integrate here. So we have a second integration. And it's going to send motor neuron to the extensors so that we're extending the opposite limb. Now again, we do not want the opposing muscles to block this action. So when we stimulate the extensors, we also inhibit the flexors. So we're sending motor information to cause relaxation of the opposing flexors as well. So one stimulus is triggering 4 reflexive actions all of whose purpose is to prevent you from continuing to injure yourself because you're touching something painful and potentially damaging. And if you had to think your way through all of that, something would go wrong in the process and you'd end up more hurt. But instead it stays at the level of the spinal cord and all of it happens very rapidly. And we're aware that all of it happens because we're still getting information that's going up to your brain at the same time. But usually what happens is that your brain is aware of it as it's happening, and then at the end you're like, oh my God, I'm glad I reacted properly, right? Good reaction time. So that's how reflexes are both very simple and then they get very complicated all at the same time. But when we look at all of this, each one still follows the same 5-step reflex arc. Other reflexes, there's tons and tons of them, and we don't need to know too many of them, but just kind of giving you a category, we have a category that are called superficial reflexes, and those are generally reactions to gentle skin stimulation. So we were, causing pain and stimulating tendons and stuff. This is just skin stimulation. So like abdominal reflexes, you'll get contraction of the abdominal muscles towards the stimulation, usually along your midline. Your plantar reflex is where you curl your toes when somebody stimulates up and down the bottom of your foot. And the interesting thing about that one is that if you have certain types of nervous system damage, you'll have an inappropriate response to that, and you'll like flare your toes or fan your toes upwards instead of curling them down. It's called a Babinski sign. And so that's one of the ones that definitely gets tested when your nervous system function is being assessed. Now, I mentioned that some reflexes are inborn and some of them are learned. And a lot of reflexes that we're born with, we actually lose as we get older because they're no longer useful. So the easiest one, if you've ever seen a hungry baby trying to nurse before, if babies reflexively turn towards touch on their cheek. And that's because when you're an infant, that usually gets you to a nipple and that gets you fed. And luckily we lose that one as we get older because we have other senses that tell us how to get food, and turning towards a touch on the cheek isn't going to work anymore. Other reflexes will develop as we get older. So when we're born, we will not close our eye when something comes right at it. But as we grow and develop and we bump into things, we learn that if we don't do that, it hurts. And so then we get this reflexive closing of the eye when something's coming straight towards it. Another thing that we'll do is, as our nervous system is still myelinating, babies will respond to stimulation of the bottoms of their feet with the babies by curling their toes up instead of flexing them down. And that's normal in infants. And then the nerves that carry all of the signals will myelinate properly, or as they mature, and then it'll transfer to this becoming normal. So age also dictates which reflexes are normal and which are not, and which are expected and which are not. All right, anybody have any questions before we get started on the autonomic nervous system? All right, think about it for a second. All right, so that's somatic stuff, skeletal muscle control. Autonomic is everything else. So when we look at the autonomic, it's a little bit more complicated. And it has a couple different names. So you notice that we've been sort of using autonomic and visceral interchangeably. Some people will call it the involuntary nervous system because none of it is under our conscious control. And generally its function is to maintain homeostasis by controlling smooth muscles and exocrine glands. And it also influences cardiac muscle. And there is some interaction with endocrine glands, which we'll talk about on Monday when we get to the endocrine system. So when we look at autonomic versus somatic, we like to compare and contrast things, right? So obviously the effectors are different. Other things that are different, to control skeletal muscle, it's always a single motor neuron between the spinal cord and the skeletal muscle, but it's two motor neurons between the spinal cord and the effector for the autonomic. Somatic nervous system tends to be very fast, so some of our most heavily myelinated axons are in the somatic nervous system, and they are less myelinated or unmyelinated in the autonomic, so speed is not as important. They can be more slow. And interestingly, there's similar usage of neurotransmitters, which we don't really need to worry about too much because we haven't spent a ton of time talking about it. So the autonomic nervous system is divided up into two divisions. They're generally opposing. The sympathetic is often referred to as our fight or flight reflexes, although it's a lot more complicated than that. And then because somebody wanted to come up with something comparable for the parasympathetic, which is kind of the opposite, they decided that rest and digest works best. But basically, when you're not in fight or flight, you're using your parasympathetic nervous system more. Now, both divisions of the autonomic nervous system innervate almost all of our visceral organs, so we call it dual innervation, and they typically have opposing actions on those organs, although there are some exceptions, and we'll touch on that one later. So this is just kind of a little bit of a chart to help you keep in mind which one does what. So sympathetic generally is in charge when you're stressed out or as a response to stress. It'll make your pupils dilate, typically increases your breathing rate, increases your heart rate, and shuts down your digestive system because it's in control when you think you might need to run for your life. And we don't have time to digest. We need our blood to go to our skeletal muscles, and so all of that is geared towards that. Now, when we're safe, then we can be calm, our pupils can shrink, we can breathe slowly and deeply, our heart rate can go back to a resting level, and our digestive system is ready to work because it's safe to eat and digest things, which is where the rest and digest thing comes in. Now, this is obviously very simplified. We're going to go into a little bit more detail. I mentioned that sympathetic is a little bit more than fight or flight. Here's a couple articles on that if you're curious. If you don't have time, don't worry about it. We don't have time to go into it either. So, all right, so we're going to look a little bit more detail at the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So similar chart, but this is comparing sympathetic to parasympathetic. And you can refer back to it later because we're going to talk about this stuff. So the sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar division, and that's because all of its axons emerge from the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord segments. So it's kind of like, it's not quite this, but it's basically like all the thoracic and lumbar segments. They have very short preganglionic fibers. I will explain that in a second. The ganglia, so the cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system are vertebral. They're really close to the vertebrae. And then they have these really long postganglionic fibers to their effectors. Now, the sympathetic nervous system has a couple of structures that it innervates without parasympathetic innervation. So that's the sole innervator, and the parasympathetic doesn't really have an equivalent to that. So this guy's a little bit more special. So sweat glands, the erector pili muscles of your hair follicles, and then the smooth muscle in the arteries and veins are only controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So the cell bodies of the preganglionic fibers are here in the spinal cord in the thoracic and lumbar segments. So they form the lateral column, which, sorry, apparently this one uses column. It should not. Horn, remember we use horn for gray matter? Lateral horn. I don't know how I missed that before. Anyway, this is somatic motor and this is sensory. So it kind of looks like this. So this is where it's coming out of the spinal cord, running with the spinal nerves of those segments. And then there are ganglia right on either side of the spinal cord where they synapse, these motor neurons synapse. And then the second motor neuron, remember I said there's always two, then goes up and down this chain, connected chain of ganglia, and then goes to whatever it's controlling. Whether that's, you know, the heart, the stomach, the eyeball, the bladder, whatever. So that's most of what we call the sympathetic pathways, is going through these chains of ganglia. And then the other thing that the sympathetic nervous system controls is the adrenal medulla. So we're going to talk about the adrenal gland when we get to the endocrine system, but the adrenal medulla is actually an extension of the sympathetic nervous system. It produces norepinephrine and epinephrine, which also function as neurotransmitters in some of the sympathetic synapses, except that they get released into the blood as hormones. So when the sympathetic nervous system is triggered, it'll release mostly epinephrine into the blood, and it'll have a hormonal effect very similar to the effect of the sympathetic nervous system itself as it synapses on its effectors. So the adrenal medulla functions as this specialized sympathetic ganglion that's acting as an endocrine gland. And as we'll see, that's very different from how the rest of the adrenal glands work. Now, if you're not familiar with the adrenal glands yet, they are these two little endocrine glands. We have a left one and a right one. They literally sit on top of your kidneys, kind of like little hats. And that's actually where their name comes from, adrenal, associated with the kidneys, which we also say renal when we're referring to them. And several people have made super adorable little cartoons of that. I like the other one because they're so cute and it talks about hats. And then I like this one because they're dressed like boxers and, you know, fight or flight reflexes. Ha 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 ha. So I use them both. All right, so that's in a nutshell how the sympathetic works, okay? So we have neuron cell bodies in the lateral horns of the thoracic and lumbar segments. Those send axons out via the spinal nerves, and then they synapse in these ganglia that are just on either side of the vertebrae. And then those send out really long axons to all of the effectors, including the adrenal medulla. Now, when we look at the parasympathetic division, we find that it's quite literally the complete opposite. So we call it the craniosacral division because all of the first motor neurons are in the cranial nerves nuclei of the brainstem and the sacral spinal segments. And they have ganglia that are actually near their effector organs So they have these really long preganglionic fibers and then these really short postganglionic fibers. So if we look at that, so this is the sympathetic stuff again. So the sacral segment, we have nuclei here, and they come out by those spinal nerves, and then they go to reproductive organs and like the bladder. And then everything else is in the brain stem. So we have a bunch of nuclei in the brain stem. And so they come out by the different cranial nerves. The vast majority of the body, those motor neuron axons travel by the vagus nerve. Because remember, the vagus nerve is the only one who sends things out of the head. So the vagus nerve then sends fibers to everything in your thorax, heart, lungs, other stuff, everything in your abdomen, up to most of your colon, and then the very end of your colon, and your kidneys, bladder, and reproductive organs are controlled by these sacral segments. So the synapses occur in ganglia that are right next to these organs. And so then the second neuron is super duper short and doesn't have to go very far. So again, complete opposite to the sympathetic nervous system. So weird. So weird, but that's how it happened. So because of that, the vagus nerve does carry the vast majority of parasympathetic input to the whole body. And so if your vagus nerve is active, it can do all of these things. So this is basically the functions of the parasympathetic nervous system in a nutshell, which is why I have this slide on here. Although I don't know how much helps keep anxiety and depression at bay is valid. Not sure about that, but maybe it does. And we're still learning more about its roles in inflammation. But the rest of it, definitely look at because it makes more sense. So, like I said, most of these organs have nerves from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division that are able to control them. And those controls are usually opposing. Whichever division has like a stronger signal, we call that autonomic tone. So for example, because the sympathetic division always is the only one controlling blood vessels, it likes to keep its blood vessels partially constricted at all times, and that's what maintains our blood pressure. We don't want it to fully relax. Usually, for most people, your parasympathetic is in charge most of the time, unless you're really stressed or your life is super dangerous. And then of course your sympathetic nervous system is going to be in charge more, and that's not really good for us. It's not made to be on all the time. It's made to be on for very short bursts, save your life, and then shut that down again. But unfortunately, our current lifestyle causes us a lot of stress. Well, especially right now, but even before everything that's happened this year, a lot of stresses that our sympathetic nervous system doesn't actually deal with really well, and that can cause it to be on all the time because it never actually gets to run or fight the things causing the stress. So anyway, so this dueling innervation, dual and dueling, sorry, I got a little too much sun today when I was outside. We get what we call this dynamic antagonism, but it sounds bad. It sounds like, oh, well, they're constantly warring with each other, but it gives us really precise control over our visceral organs that lets it really respond to whatever is safe for that period of time. And then in the right kind of situation, one division will entirely dominate, So, you know, when the sympathetic nervous system thinks you're going to die, it takes over, like shut your guts down. It, you know, amps up your heart rate. It expands your airways. You're breathing really hard, all of that stuff, right? Because it's taking over for a period of time. And when you're sleeping, it's usually your sympathetic that's pretty much completely taken over. Now there are, and that's your dominant sympathetic tone. It's not a great state to be in. Okay, we're gonna just run a little bit over. There are times when they actually work together. Not very often, but sex is one example of when both divisions of the autonomic nervous system have to work together. So obviously you should be in a safe place to have sex because it makes you very physically vulnerable. So your sympathetic nervous system can't be amped too high or it could inhibit. So your parasympathetic nervous system starts in control when sex is initiated. So it's responsible for relaxing the blood vessels that are needed to do things like achieve erection or general arousal and engorgement of all reproductive organs in both sexes. But in order to actually achieve ejaculation or a female orgasm, you need sympathetic tone for the muscle contractions and stuff like that. So you start out by being in a high parasympathetic tone, and then you have to finish off with a high sympathetic tone. So this is one of the rare examples of cooperative effects of both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So because of the things that only the sympathetic division innervates, it gives them a couple of unique roles that go from that. So it's really the sole one in charge of maintaining blood pressure. And also because of its control over blood vessels and sweat glands, it's the primary one responsible for all of our body temperature regulation. So our thermoregulatory effects. Another blood pressure thing that it does is release an enzyme called renin that is involved in blood pressure maintenance from the kidneys. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the endocrine system, maybe, I don't know. And then it has these metabolic effects as well because the adrenal medulla releases the epinephrine and norepinephrine as a hormone in the blood. They will act on cells to increase their metabolic rate, increase blood sugar levels, and mobilize fats from your adipose, all because if you're in a fight or flight response, you want to make sure that your muscles have enough fuel and your whole body is ready to go to do whatever it is that it needs to do, because it really is set up for fighting for your life. Okay. So, all right, we'll just call it. All right, so I will finish this up later because we're kind of out of time, and there's just enough more to go that I think that it'll drag on super far, and this seems like a good stopping point. So I'll stop us here, but I will do this, and I will do special senses on Friday. If you're able to make it on Friday afternoon, I'll put it into the schedule and make an announcement. Then please feel free to join me. Otherwise, I will talk to myself and post it on YouTube. And then we'll do endocrine on Monday because we have some sort of, I don't know what's going on. Let me look at it again before I keep talking. Where did my schedule go? If I start talking without looking at the schedule, even though I just looked at it earlier, I will say something wrong and confuse myself. Okay, so, yes. That's what we're doing. Okay, so we'll do endocrine on Monday. And then if I don't get through all of it, I'm going to try really hard to make it fit. But if I don't get through all of it, I will finish up the very, very last of it on Wednesday, but it'll still be plenty for you guys to study from, especially because the whole lecture will be posted. And then your next exam is going to be available on Friday. So obviously I need to get them graded as soon as possible. I am working on it. I apologize for any delays. I do my best, I swear, but you know, life and stuff. So next exam will be Friday, as in next Friday, a little over a week from now. So I'll make sure to get everything graded so you know how to adjust your studying. This will be, again, like I said, review. We'll run back through nervous system and special senses and endocrine. Please, please, please try to study for as much as you can for the next week on what you already have at the very least and what's in your textbook and stuff, so that you have questions that Wednesday, and we can go over any concepts that you still find confusing. All right, does anybody have any questions? I said I will make announcements for that. All right, I'm gonna stop this recording.